Today we're going to be working on an 03 Chevy Suburban with a 5.3, and we're going to be changing the water pump. So to get started, take off this cover and the air intake. It's 8mm for both the bolt on top and the clamps that go at the throttle body and at the mass airflow sensor. So once you get those loose, this just pulls out. We're going to raise the vehicle up, get the radiator drained. Okay, so on this radiator you can see there's the petcock and you got a little outlet there. I'm going to stick a piece of hose over that outlet so that we can drain it into a bucket. So we've got our piece of hose there, open the petcock, and we're going to drain the radiator. That's what it looks like where the hose is on. Okay, next we're going to remove the fan shroud, which is going to be a couple of trim clips here on the bottom, one on each side, and then a couple of 10mm bolts right here, one on each side. So there was actually 2 more trim clips back here towards the radiator. So once you get those 4 out, you should be able to move the hose. And pick that up out of the way. Next, we're going to need to take the fan and fan clutch off. So, got a large crescent on here. I'm just going to smack that with a hammer, try and bust this nut loose. So, 3-pound sledge, large crescent, just a tap in counterclockwise direction. And our fan is coming off. That up out of the way. Next, we're going to use a 15mm and take the belt off. Got 3 15mm bolts on the tensioner. Remove the tensioner, and we're going to take the clamps loose on the hoses. All right, we're going to start with the lower radiator hose. Next, we'll do these other two smaller hoses. All right, we got those three hoses loose. We'll take off the upper radiator hose next. That's just a clamp. This one right here. They make these hose tools that you can get in behind that rubber and push it off of all the way around. Kind of work your way. You see that's pretty corroded and nasty in there. So we're getting ready to take the bolts out of the water pump, which is the final step for removal. If we were going to reuse a thermostat, there's two 10mm here. You take the housing and thermostat out, but in the new assembly, we just got a new housing and thermostat all as one piece. So the 6 bolts that hold the water pump on are here. 1, 2, 3 on this side. 1, 2, 3 on this side. So we'll remove those 6 and then we can remove the pump. All right, I got the last bolt loose. You can see the coolant pouring out. And make sure you got a drain pan underneath there. remove the pump. We got a little gasket removal to do here before we get prepped to put the new one back on. And we got to find that last bolt that I just dropped. There's something I like to do while I'm removing the bolts. You take them out and then you put them in the new part. That way, just in case there's any difference in lengths, that they go in the right spot before you have this going back onto the block. All right, so gasket on the passenger side did stick. Doesn't take much to get it off of there, but then we're gonna clean up this surface and the other as well. Then dry out the ports, so we'll make sure we get a good seal when we put the new water pump on. So on this model, the gaskets actually fit over the bolts. So you'll just slip that back on. And it'll help keep things aligned as we install it. Once you're ready to install, make sure your surfaces are cleaned off. Get your gaskets and your bolts put on. Get in the line, and I usually try to start the top bolts. These are 10 millimeter. All right, next you're going to want to install those bolts, but torque them. And the torque value for these is 11 foot-pounds, which is the same as 132 inch-pounds. So, check all 6 of them. All right, our torque's good. Now we're going to reinstall the radiator hoses. We'll start with the 2 smaller ones. Slip those back on, and we'll go to the lower radiator hose. That back on, and then we'll go to the upper. All right, and we got 4 clamps to tighten. We'll get our belt put back on, and then we'll put the fan back on. First we'll put our tensioner back on, then we'll put our belt on, and then we'll put the fan on. You want to get these spring clamps seated back in the same place that they were to avoid leaks, because that hose has a memory in it. You can see the indentions in the hose. hard to get it to release and be in the same place as you want it. It'll kind of snap. Not quite seated right. Sorry, I don't have a good view of this one. I need a camera person. All right, so we got these two small ones, the lower radiator hose, and the uppers right here. Get that clamp back on with an 8mm. Try to get it seated in the same groove as well. Like I said, these hoses, they have a memory, and if you don't get the clamp in the same place, sometimes they develop a leak. We'll get the belt tensioner next. It's going to be a 15mm. Has two long bolts which go on the top and a short one that goes in here. See, the distance is back. The short bolt goes in the bottom. All right, so how the belt gets routed is as shown. Underneath, on the crank, up around the water pump, down back underneath the power steering, up to the alternator. It will go underneath this idler pulley and then across to the tensioner. So I'm gonna have to crank down the tensioner in order to put it on the idler pulley. Just do a quick check. You look at every pulley that it's on. Make sure that the belt is seated in the grooves. Down the crank. Now this vehicle did get a lot of antifreeze on the belt even before I changed the water pump. So I'm gonna blow it off with some brake clean, try and dry things out before we start it up. Otherwise the belt might squeak because of the wetness. And next up, we gotta go back on with the fan. Oh, we gotta remove the little plastic protector from the factory on the new water pump. Get this lined up and just spin it on. Now with the belt engaged, we're gonna basically do the opposite of when we took it off. Get our wrench here and I'm gonna line it up. I'll give it a quick smack with a hammer just to try and tighten it up. We're going to put our fan shroud back on, and we'll get our air intake back on. Hook our mass airflow sensor tube back up and put our shield on, we'll be done. Struggle to find a good camera view here, trying to see how the fan shroud goes back on. You got to lift that radiator hose up out of the way. Alright, it's a little bit hard to see here, but you need to have the top loose and the bottom needs to be setting in this groove right there. See the bottom? Slide it into that groove before you can line it up with the trim clips. Same thing on the other side. Once you get the bottom set in there, then you can install those push clips. Do the same thing on the other side. And then we've got these two 10mm bolts to finish it off. All right, fan shroud back on. Now we're going to put in the air breather tube and the cover, then fill it up with antifreeze. Air breather's got two 8mm clamps, one over here on the mass airflow sensor. One on the throttle body. And then the cover on top is also an 8mm. Now we're ready to fill it up with coolant. That's how you change a water pump on a 5.3 liter and a 03 Suburban.